Kafka is finally coming, and she looks absolutely mesmerizing. She is all about DOTs, aka damage over time. She dishes out high scaling shock dots and can immediately cause those dots to produce their damage without needing to wait for the enemy's turn for the dots to proc naturally. The more dots you can apply onto the enemy, then the more damage you'll get out of Kafka. And this can be any type of dot. Dots that come from a character's kit like Sampo and Serval, or weakness break dot. Kafka's playstyle is going to be one of the more unique playstyles in Honkai Star Rail so far, but that's not the reason I and many other people will be pulling for Kafka, right?
She was the first person the Trailblazer set eyes on, and meaning Kafka must have been there for the Trailblazer's first words, the first step. No wonder so many players count her.
Okay.
Alright, let's get into her kit, starting with her skill. Her skill is going to deal AoE lightning damage, and all dots immediately will produce their damage up to a certain percent. At talent level 7, the selected target is 130% of Kafka's attack, and adjacent is 48.7% of her attack. The instant dot damage is 69% of their original damage. So you can imagine, if we can apply multiple dots onto the enemy, and specifically really powerful dots like Bleed or Wind Shear, and even Entanglement, having all of them produce their damage at 69% of their potency is still pretty powerful. Kafka herself also applies pretty strong Shock Dot with all of her other abilities. So combine this with the other characters on your team, and her skill has the potential to do lots and lots of damage. We'll get into more specifics later. I'll show you some calculations that I did on Weakness Break so that we can get a better understanding on how much damage we could potentially be getting out of all of these dots. Now let's move on to her ultimate. Her ultimate deals AoE lightning damage with a 100% base chance to apply shock, and then immediately cause those enemies to take damage from the shock dot at 92.5% of the original damage. This is for talent level 7. Also, all of these dots that are immediately producing their damage will not reduce the turn count of the dots, so they will still continue to take dot damage normally when the enemy's turn comes around. The shock state from her ultimate will last 2 turns, and the scaling for this is also quite high at talent level 7. While shocked, enemies will receive lightning dot equal to 197.5% of Kafka's attack. Compare this to other dot characters like Serval. Serval is 70% of her attack at the same level, and Sampo is 35% of his attack at the same level. Although with Sampo, since it's Wind Shear, it can stack, and also he increases the vulnerability of dots on enemies. So even though it is quite low, he has ways of increasing the multiplier. But nonetheless, 192.5% is still very large scaling. So her ultimate and her skill having the ability to immediately produce dot damage is going to be her largest source of damage. Now, Kafka has an Ascension trace that allows her ultimate to produce all dots on the enemies, just like her skill, because without that, only the shock gets produced immediately. Thankfully, the Ascension is a very early Ascension, so we'll get this really cool effect without needing too much investment. And so it's definitely that Ascension 2 trace that makes this ultimate have the largest potential for damage. So basically, Kafka's ultimate is a souped up version of her skill. It causes all of the dots to produce their damage at nearly 100% of their original damage. To get to 100% of their original damage, you'll need to raise her talent up to level 10. At level 7, it's going to be 92.5% of the original damage. And lastly, her ultimate is a 120 energy ultimate. We'll go into a little bit more detail about this Ascension 2 effect, but for now, let's go ahead and move on to her talent. After an ally of Kafka's uses a basic attack on an enemy target, Kafka will immediately launch a follow-up attack and deal lightning damage equal to 103.25% of her attack at talent level 7 to that target. She also has a 100% base chance to inflict shock equivalent to that applied by her ultimate to the attacked enemy for 2 turns. This talent is also going to regenerate 10 energy, and that's going to be important later on when we start talking about how often we can cast Kafka's ultimate. There are a lot of implications on this talent and a lot of questions up in the air on how exactly this talent behaves. Because depending on how this talent behaves, there's a lot of potential for damage for Kafka. If this talent overwrites the shock from the ultimate, that would be the less desirable outcome as opposed to having it be an extra stack of shock. There are high high hopes that the talent is a separate stack of shock because the wording on it is a little bit different from Serval's. We know that Serval's shocks do not stack. They get overwritten. If you're to shock an enemy with Serval's technique going into the battle, and then if you pop her skill, then her skill is going to overwrite the shock of her technique. And then casting her ultimate does not apply another stack of shock. Instead, it's just going to simply extend the turns on the current shock from the skill. And so since the wording between the two skills are different, there is the potential that this talent is actually another stack of shock. And so the hope is that it is, and then that means that Kafka's damage output is going to be a lot more. Because if it wasn't obvious, producing 2 instances of shock dot is going to be better than just producing the damage from 1. And also in general, it is possible to apply the same type of dot to an enemy. For example, when it comes to burn, every character on the team can apply their burn. So if this talent is coded in such a way that the shock is a different type of shock, then that's going to be the best case scenario. And since this talent relies on an ally to use a basic attack, we want allies that rely on basic attacks or enhanced basic attacks, because enhanced attacks should still fall under the umbrella of basic attacks and should still trigger her talent. This makes the upcoming character Luca a very good potential partner for her. Now let's go through Kafka's traces. Starting with her stat traces, she gets HP, attack, and effect hit rate traces. She's going to get 24% attack, 18% effect hit rate, and 10% HP. 24% attack is great for just increasing her dot damage, and the effect hit rate allows her to apply her shocks more consistently. Her first special Ascension 2 trace is the one that ties her kit all together and makes her kit very unique. It's the trace that will immediately produce all of the dots on an enemy when her ultimate is used. The scaling for this should be equivalent to that of whatever level your ultimate trace is. And so since I've been using level 7 for this entire video, that's going to be 92.5% of the original damage. But if you do raise her up to level 10, it will reach 100% of the original damage. Her next Ascension trace at Ascension 4 is that enemies defeated that were shocked will regen Kafka's energy by 5. And pretty much every enemy that you're fighting is going to be shocked, so a very solid trace to help us get more ultimates. More ultimates just means a ton more damage. If we can get our ultimates off to produce their dots before they run out, then the better off we are. Her final Ascension at Ascension 6 is a increase to effect hit rate by 30% on all abilities with a chance to apply shock. So this means that her ultimate, technique, and follow-up attack all get a 30% increase. All of those abilities also have a 100% base chance, so in essence, they all go up to 130. And if you add in her trace, she's at 148% effect hit rate for all of her abilities that can apply shock. And so with that said, you're probably wondering how much effect hit rate Kafka needs in order to guarantee shock on every enemy in the game. Currently in the game, 40% effect hit resistance is the highest in the game, and those are reserved for the big bosses like Svarog and Kokolia, and the Deer boss, and other bosses like them. So in order to guarantee our shock being applied to these types of enemies, and that means everything with an effect hit resistance lower than that, we need at least 166 to 167% effect hit rate to guarantee. So if we're at 148, this means we need an extra 18% effect hit rate to reach that threshold. Very, very achievable. Now, also because status effects are applied per hit, this means that when it comes to our skill, it actually hits 3 times, so we don't need that much. We basically have 3 chances to apply shock. But when it comes to our ultimate, unfortunately, it only hits 1 time. So in order to guarantee the shock for our ultimate, we do want to try to hit that 166 to 167% to guarantee the shock. And then as for her talent, unsure of how many hits that actually does, but since the ultimate was only 1 hit, we kind of have no choice if we want to hit that guarantee. Now, I quickly want to revisit her skill. Just in case it wasn't clear, the skill will not produce dots on adjacent targets and only the selected target. However, her ultimate will produce the dots on all targets, and her ultimate targets every enemy on the field. And on the topic of her ultimate, since her ultimate is really one of the main damage sources for Kafka, because she can produce those dots at pretty much 100% of their original damage, we want her to get her ult as quickly as she can. This means we definitely want to be building Kafka for speed so that she can generate enough energy using her skills. So taking a look at Kafka within a vacuum where she doesn't get attacked and is regenerating energy in that way, it takes Kafka 2 skills and 6 follow-up attacks to fully regenerate her ultimate. This is essentially 2 turns if every single one of your teammates does a basic attack to trigger Kafka's talent. This is also assuming we aren't defeating any shocked enemies, so defeating shocked enemies makes it even easier to generate our ultimate. Now we can cut this down with an energy recharge rope. We can cut it down to 2 skills and 4 follow-up attacks. This gives us more breathing room for our other characters to actually use their skills instead of being pretty much Kafka talent trigger bots. So this is something you want to consider for your build. Do you want to run energy recharging your rope, or do you want to run attack so you can get better damage from Kafka's dots and better damage from the actual skill? Some quick damage calcs here. A Kafka at level 80 with her signature Lightcone, reaching an attack of 4,141. Her skill does 4,186 to the selected target, and then the shock damage that is produced by her ultimate and talent is 6,392 with an attack percent link rope. If you decide to instead switch out the attack percentage link rope for an energy regeneration rate, your damage will go down to 3,636 for the skill, and then your shock damage from the ultimate and talent is going to drop down to 5,525. This is about a 14.5% damage difference. So sacrifice this amount of damage in order for the potential to get your ult up faster so that you can produce those dots again. It's up to you to decide what's going to be better, because every matchup is going to be slightly different. I will personally be trying out the energy recharge link rope and see how it feels. I also want my characters to be able to use their skills as well and not just be bots for triggering Kafka's talent. Right now it seems that Kafka's best teammates are going to be characters that have dots within their kit. These are characters like Sample, Serval, and Luca. The more dots we can apply to the enemy, then the better our ultimate damage and our skill damage is going to be. As of right now, it seems that Sample is going to be one of her best teammates because he can increase the target's dot damage taken. At talent level 7, he can increase that dot damage taken by 26.25% for 2 turns. However, I'm going to be that off-meta person today and present to you guys an alternative. Because if you understand how dot damage is calculated, Defense Shred and Vulnerability are 2 ways to increase dot damage taken by the enemy. Now, it actually turns out that Vulnerability is a better multiplier for increasing that damage, but Defense Shred is still a pretty good way to increase that damage. Sampo only reaches 26.25 at level 7, and for example, a character like Silver Wolf provides about 45% Defense Shred at the same level. So what's better, 26.25% vulnerability to dots or 45% defense shred? Well, it turns out that 26.25% increase to dot damage is slightly weaker than 45% defense shred. But we're talking like very, very slightly better. So a character at level 80 with 50% break effect versus a level 90 enemy and 300 points of toughness with 45% defense shred, each stack of entanglement is dealing 6,338. With 26.25% of dot vulnerability, it goes down to 6,103. Now, if you manage to get Sample up to max level here, talent level 10, it goes up to 6,297, which is still just slightly below defense shred. If you were to replace Silver Wolf with Pela, she manages to hit 40% defense shred at max level 10. And then in that case, Sampo wins out, but just by a very tiny amount. But why do I bring up defense shred versus dot vulnerability? Sample also has wind shear dot baked into his kit, so that's also going to help out Kafka's damage with her skill and her ultimate. Silver Wolf and Pela don't have any dots within their kit, because it's not just dot characters that can work well with Kafka. I think that regular weakness break is just as strong, if not stronger, than dots that come from a character's kit. After all, weakness break dot is based on the character's level. So if you max level your character, their break damage and the dot that comes from it has the potential to do a ton of damage. Let's take that example again with Quantum that I just mentioned. 45% defense shred with a level 80 character and 50% break effect against a target with 300 points of toughness is 6,338 damage per stack of entanglement. Multiply that by 5 and we get 31,690 damage. Being able to proc that twice, once with our ultimate, and then when the enemy's turn comes around, that's a lot of damage. A lot of potential damage. If you can somehow get res penetration in there, so a character like Zila, the dot damage increases to 7,922. 7,922 times 5 is about 40,000 damage. That is pretty strong. The downside from this, obviously, is that weakness break against bosses takes several hits, but dots that come from character kits can be applied within the 1 turn, provided the character has enough effect hit rate to guarantee the application. but we're talking bosses here. We don't usually one-shot these bosses, so we're definitely going to get that weakness break on them. So now let's take physical and bleed. We know that Sushang is pretty good at doing physical break. So with 50% break effect here, and against a boss that has health in the 6-digit range, 45% defense reduction, our dot damage is 21,000 damage. So hopefully the picture here that I'm trying to illustrate is clear. You don't just have to use dot-based characters with Kafka. She can definitely be used with other characters that can weakness break that deal lots of dot damage from that weakness break. And now a quick rundown on usable Lightcones for Kafka. She has a lot of great 4-star options actually. Eyes of Prey for Mana and Good Night and Sleep Well are all going to be super solid options for her. I will make another video going into a little bit more depth on her Lightcone options. And then a quick mention on her Eidolons, because her first 2 Eidolons are massive increases to dot damage. The first one being that whenever her talent triggers a follow-up attack, she has a 100% base chance to increase the dot damage received by the target by 30%. This is basically equivalent to Sampo's ability. And then her next Eidolon E2, while she's on the field, dot dealt by all allies increases by 25%. So yeah, just a lot of dot damage increase. If you guys happen to have any questions about weakness break or effect hit rate, I actually have 2 videos covering those 2 topics right here.